HOA president tased my pregnant wife. Finds out I own the entire police department. Entitled Peepee. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from. I'd like to introduce you to my family. We live in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind you see in real estate ads with perfectly manicured lawns, rows of houses that all look the same, and streets lined with trees. The kind of place where everything seems peaceful on the surface. At least that's how it used to feel. My wife Sarah and I had been looking for a fresh start when we moved here. We had big plans, a cozy house, a calm life, and the joy of starting our family. Sarah was pregnant at the time, and that brought a special kind of excitement to our home. She was glowing, full of anticipation, and we were both eager to build our little haven. We didn't want anything to disturb our peaceful existence, especially not after everything we'd been through before. But peace was hard to come by in this neighborhood. We weren't even fully settled in before we began hearing the stories, rumors really, about the Homeowners Association, or HOA as they like to call themselves. It wasn't long before we realized that the HOA was less about helping neighbors and more about control. The president, Mr. Lawson, was the embodiment of everything you'd expect in someone given too much power. He was an older man, always walking around with a clipboard, wearing a permanent scowl like he was some kind of neighborhood sheriff. He had a reputation for being strict, overbearing, and always ready to hand out fines. Whether it was a stray lawn chair left outside for too long, a fence that was an inch too high, or a tree that grew just a little bit too tall, Mr. Lawson had something to say about it. He wasn't shy about his power either. He had the backing of most of the local law enforcement, so no one dared to challenge him. From the very beginning, we felt his eyes on us. We were new, trying to blend in and make our house feel like home, but it seemed like Mr. Lawson was waiting for us to slip up. I remember Sarah getting a letter about how our mailbox wasn't up to HOA standards. It was ridiculous. Nothing wrong with it. But there it was, another warning. That was just one of the many little things we would later find out were his way of making sure he could keep everyone under his thumb. At first, we tried to brush it off. After all, it was just a mailbox, right? But as time passed, it became clear that this wasn't just about minor violations. It was a constant power trip for Mr. Lawson. He wasn't just the HOA president, he was the self-appointed ruler of the neighborhood, and it wasn't long before he started making our lives miserable. Through it all, Sarah tried to stay calm. She was pregnant, and her patience was wearing thin. Every little thing started to feel like a personal attack. I could see it in her eyes how stressed she was becoming, how each new letter, each new rule, chipped away at the peace we'd worked so hard to build. But we kept pushing through, trying to stay optimistic, trying to believe it would all settle down. We never imagined how much worse it would get. At first, the issues with the HOA were small, insignificant really. A missed lawn trimming here, a bit of clutter in the yard there. Nothing that should have been a big deal, but that was exactly how Mr. Lawson saw it. Each time something happened, he'd show up, clipboard in hand, a scowl on his face, ready to write us up. At first, we tried to be understanding. Maybe we were just being too sensitive. Maybe these things were just a part of suburban life. So we paid the fines, trimmed the bushes, painted the fence, but the fines kept coming. One day, I found a notice taped to our door about how our garden gnomes were too kitschy and didn't meet the HOA's aesthetic standards. Garden gnomes. Really? The absurdity of it hit me as I read the paper. Sarah, sitting on the couch with her hand on her stomach, looked over at me, shaking her head. It was one of those moments where I could see the frustration in her eyes, but she just sighed and rubbed her belly as if trying to calm herself down. We had hoped that it was just a fluke, something minor, but the next thing we knew, it was another letter, this time about how our garage door paint didn't match the approved color palette. That was the breaking point for me. The paint wasn't even peeling. It was a minor shade off, but who was keeping track of these ridiculous rules? Sarah was getting more upset, and understandably so. Pregnancy, as any father-to-be knows, isn't exactly stress-free. It's a time when emotions run high and worries mount. On top of that, the constant HOA notices piled on. I could see her getting more worn out, her energy drained by things that should have been simple joys. The mailbox saga, the gnome incident, the garage door, All of it was like an invisible weight pressing down on her. The stress was starting to affect her health too. She'd wake up in the middle of the night, restless, complaining of headaches and backaches, and sometimes she'd cry over the constant pressure. I'd hold her, trying to reassure her, but it was hard to feel like things would get better when every time we turned around, Mr. Lawson had another ridiculous rule for us to follow. We tried to ignore it, tried to tell ourselves that once the baby arrived, we could focus on bigger things. But it was getting harder to just sit back and take it. Sarah would bring it up at dinner, frustrated but trying to stay calm. "It's just a small thing," she'd say, but I could hear the strain in her voice. Then came the lawn incident. I hadn't had time to mow the grass for a few days, and I'll admit it had grown a little too high. I was planning to take care of it that weekend, but before I could, I found another notice on our front door. A $100 fine for overgrown grass. $100 for grass. I was livid. I marched over to Mr. Lawson's house to confront him, but of course he wasn't there. Just his wife, who seemed to think this was all perfectly normal. She handed me another one of those papers, this time accusing me of violating community harmony because the grass was a tad long. I tried not to lose my temper, but it wasn't easy. When I got back inside, I saw Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, rubbing her temples, clearly overwhelmed. She didn't say anything, but the tears in her eyes spoke volumes. I couldn't stand seeing her like that. It felt like every step we took forward, the HOA pushed us 2 steps back. The stress kept building, and as much as we tried to ignore it, the weight of the constant surveillance, the fines, the rules, they weren't just ruining our peace of mind. They were affecting our lives, and Sarah, more than anyone, was bearing the brunt of it. It didn't take long before Mr. Lawson's actions went from annoying to outright disrespectful. It was like he wasn't content with just enforcing petty rules. He wanted to make us feel small. One afternoon, as I was working in the garage, I saw him walk past our house, clipboard in hand, like he was scouting for his next target. I had gotten used to seeing him linger around, but this time, something about the way he glanced at us felt different. It was colder, more judgmental. A few days later, we got a letter about our trash cans. Apparently, they were being left out too long, something we'd never been warned about before. It was only 24 hours past the pickup, but there it was. Another fine. $50 this time. I knew it was nothing more than another excuse to keep pushing us around, but I tried to let it go. Sarah, however, wasn't as easily convinced. One evening, she walked out to check the mail and came back inside with a letter in her hand. I could see her jaw clenched, her lips tight with frustration. She handed it to me without saying a word. It was from Mr. Lawson, this time threatening us with a formal warning if we didn't replace our front door with one that met community standards. Our door wasn't anything extravagant. It was a simple wooden design, perfectly fine and in good condition. But according to the letter, it was too dated and violated some vague clause about maintaining a modern, cohesive aesthetic. I could feel Sarah's anger rising just beneath the surface. She was trying so hard to keep things calm, to not let these small things get under her skin, but they were wearing her down. I could see how much she wanted to scream, to say something to him, but she kept it in. She knew any kind of confrontation would just lead to more trouble. But then Mr. Lawson took it further. One morning, as I was leaving for work, I saw him standing at the foot of our driveway, staring at Sarah. She was out on the porch sipping her coffee when he walked up to her without any warning, his hands on his hips. I couldn't hear what he was saying from the street, but I could see her face change. She looked stunned, confused, maybe even a little scared. It wasn't just the usual complaints or rules. There was something personal in the way he addressed her. As I started to walk toward them, I noticed his tone getting sharper. He was talking about our yard again, something about how the flowers were too wild and not kept in line. He was practically inspecting every little thing about our home, like it was his personal project to tear it apart. Sarah stood there, trying to remain polite, trying to keep it together, but I could tell the strain was getting to her. By the time I reached them, Mr. Lawson had already turned to leave, but not before throwing one last remark over his shoulder. "Make sure you follow the rules next time, or we'll have to escalate things." I couldn't believe it. I hadn't heard him talk to her like that before. It wasn't just rude, it was mean-spirited. Sarah was shaking her head, trying not to cry, but I could see the frustration written all over her face. She took a deep breath and muttered, "I can't do this anymore. It's not worth it." I could tell she was close to breaking. Every day it was something new. A rule we didn't know existed. A fine for something minor, or some personal jab from Mr. Lawson. And he knew exactly how to push her buttons. He'd seen her stress, her exhaustion, and it seemed like he was using it against her. Each time he came around, it felt more like a calculated attack than an attempt to keep the neighborhood in line. That day, Sarah tried to stay calm, but the tears came anyway. She locked herself in the bedroom for a while, and I just stood there, feeling powerless. It hurt me to see her like that, trapped in a situation where no matter how hard we tried to do the right thing, it felt like we were always wrong in Mr. Lawson's eyes. The tipping point came at the community meeting, a place we had hoped we would never have to attend. It was one of those monthly HOA gatherings where the president would lay out his latest list of demands and try to bend everyone into his vision of what the neighborhood should be. Sarah and I had been reluctant to go, but after the constant barrage of fines and accusations, we felt like we had no choice. We hoped that maybe, just maybe, we could put our foot down and challenge Mr. Lawson in front of everyone. But we quickly learned how wrong we were. The meeting was held in the community center, a small room with beige walls and uncomfortable folding chairs. We walked in a little late, but not by much, and took a seat in the back. The room was filled with our neighbors, most of whom were too afraid to speak up against Mr. Lawson, knowing that he had a way of making anyone who disagreed with him pay. He was standing at the front, droning on about lawn maintenance rules and new policies that didn't make sense. Just the usual nonsense. Sarah was visibly uncomfortable. She was 5 months pregnant at the time, and the stress had been getting to her, but she still kept a calm exterior, sitting quietly beside me. I could feel her hand on her stomach, rubbing it gently, trying to ease the anxiety that had become a constant companion in our lives. Then Mr. Lawson called on us. It wasn't a surprise, really. He knew we'd been at odds for a while, and I could feel his eyes on us even before he singled us out. "Mr. and Mrs. Grayson," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a knife. "I trust you're aware of the new guidelines for your property." He didn't even wait for us to respond before continuing. "Your lawn is still in violation, and frankly, I'm getting tired of reminding you." I could feel my blood start to boil, and I saw Sarah's grip on her chair tighten. The room went quiet, the tension thick enough to slice through. It wasn't about the lawn anymore. It had never been about the lawn. This was personal. Mr. Lawson was trying to make an example of us in front of everyone. Sarah, trying to keep her cool, stood up slowly, her voice shaky but clear. "We've been doing our best, Mr. Lawson. This is getting out of hand." She was pregnant, she was exhausted, and she was fed up. "We can't keep living like this. You're harassing us, and it's not right." The room was still. No one dared speak up, and Mr. Lawson's face twisted into a sneer. "Harassing you?" he scoffed. "If you can't follow the rules of this neighborhood, maybe you don't belong here. Maybe you should consider moving." That was the moment it all snapped. Sarah took a step forward, her voice rising. "You don't get to talk to us like that. You have no right to treat us this way." Her words hit harder than I thought they would, but instead of backing down, Mr. Lawson stepped toward her, his face inches from hers. I saw red. Without warning, he pushed her. Hard. The force of it sent her stumbling back, and she barely managed to catch herself before falling. My heart stopped, a cold rage sweeping over me. I leapt to my feet, but it felt like the whole room froze. Everyone watching in stunned silence. Sarah, holding her belly, tried to steady herself, her face pale. The shock was overwhelming, but what came next was pure fury. "How dare you!" I shouted, stepping between them. I was seething, my fists clenched at my sides. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Mr. Lawson didn't flinch. He just stood there, smirking, like it was all part of the game. "Maybe you'll finally learn your place," he muttered under his breath, as if the words were meant to cut deeper than just the physical push. But it was too much now. I wasn't going to back down. I wasn't going to let him get away with it any longer. The thought of my pregnant wife standing there shaken and hurt sent a surge of adrenaline through me. "This ends now," I said, my voice low but steady. I could feel the weight of the room pressing in on me, but I didn't care. I could see Sarah, still holding on to the back of the chair, trying to catch her breath, her face flushed with a mix of anger and disbelief. This wasn't just about the fines anymore. It wasn't about the ridiculous rules or the constant intimidation. This was about dignity, about respect, about what I would and wouldn't tolerate. The moment stretched out, thick with tension. I knew that this was the turning point, the moment everything would change. I wouldn't let him get away with this. Not now. Not ever. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking with anger, and dialed 911. I was furious, but I also knew this was something that needed to be reported. The push, the way Mr. Lawson had humiliated Sarah in front of everyone, it couldn't go unaddressed. I was hoping, praying even, that the police would show up, take control of the situation, and finally give us the justice we deserved. When the dispatcher answered, I explained the situation as clearly as I could, trying to stay calm, trying to hold back the rage that kept boiling up in me. I need an officer at the community center right now, I said. A man just pushed my pregnant wife, and I need this handled. He's the HOA president, and this is an assault. The dispatcher assured me someone would be there shortly, and I hung up, my mind racing. I tried to keep my cool, but deep down, I knew this wasn't going to be as simple as making a call and expecting everything to be resolved. Something told me that Mr. Lawson had more power than I realized. Sure enough, just a few minutes later, the police arrived. I could hear the squad car pulling up outside the center, the sirens fading away as they parked. I didn't know whether to feel relieved or even more on edge. Two officers stepped out of the car, Officer Daniels and Officer Hayes. Both men were familiar faces. I'd seen them around the neighborhood before. They knew Mr. Lawson well, or so I assumed. They greeted him with a handshake, one that lasted just a little too long, and then turned their attention to Sarah and me. "We're here now. What seems to be the problem?" Officer Daniels asked, but his tone wasn't exactly friendly. It was more dismissive, as if we were causing some kind of unnecessary drama. I quickly explained what had happened, my voice rising with frustration. "He pushed my wife. She's pregnant, and she's been dealing with this man's harassment for months. I'm not letting this go." Officer Hayes glanced over at Mr. Lawson, who was standing off to the side, his arms crossed, watching us. There was no hint of surprise in his expression, only that smug, familiar smirk. "Well, from what I've heard, Mr. Lawson has been a good neighbor here for years," Officer Hayes said, his voice low but firm. "Seems like you're the ones causing trouble, not him." I froze. "What? Are you seriously taking his side? He just physically assaulted my wife." "I'm sure Mr. Lawson didn't mean any harm," Officer Daniels cut in, as if trying to diffuse the situation with a calmness that only made my blood boil. "But we need to get all the facts. Why don't we sit down and talk this through like adults?" I stared at him, stunned. "Are you kidding me? Are you really just going to let him get away with this?" Mr. Lawson stepped forward then, all smooth charm. "Look, I'm just trying to keep the neighborhood in order. These people have been nothing but trouble since the day they moved in. I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding here." It was like a switch had been flipped. The police officers didn't even try to hide their bias. They were standing there nodding along, agreeing with him as if we were the ones in the wrong. "That's right," Officer Hayes said. "We've had no complaints about Mr. Lawson before. He's been doing his job, trying to keep the neighborhood nice, and now you're accusing him of something serious." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Sarah was standing next to me, her face pale, her hand resting gently on her stomach, trying to keep calm. I could see the hurt in her eyes as the officers kept siding with Mr. Lawson. It was like we were invisible, like our pain didn't matter. "Look," Officer Daniels said, clearly trying to wrap things up, "I think we should all just calm down and handle this civilly. Maybe we can work something out without escalating things." I was speechless. The officers were practically treating Mr. Lawson like a hero, the way they deferred to him, like he was untouchable. It was clear that they weren't here to help us. They were here to protect him. It didn't take much for me to realize Mr. Lawson had control over them, just like he did over everything else in this neighborhood. The officers gave me a look that said everything. They weren't going to take any action. They weren't going to press charges. They weren't even going to acknowledge that something was wrong. Instead, they turned to Mr. Lawson, making it clear that they saw this as an isolated incident, a mere misunderstanding that didn't require further attention. As they walked away, I felt like the walls were closing in on me. The realization hit hard. The police were in on it. They weren't here for justice. They were here to protect Mr. Lawson's little kingdom, and we were just intruders in their eyes. I turned to Sarah, who was struggling to hold herself together, and in that moment, everything changed. I knew with absolute certainty that I couldn't let this go. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. If no one else was going to stand up for us, then I would. I'd make sure that Mr. Lawson, and everyone like him, paid for what they had done. The tension in the room was suffocating, thick with anger and frustration, but it wasn't over yet. Sarah, trembling with rage and helplessness, finally spoke up. Her voice, though strained, cut through the air. "This isn't over," she said, her words laced with a fierce determination. "You've pushed us far enough, Mr. Lawson. I'm not backing down anymore." I could feel the heat rising in her voice. I knew this wasn't just about the fines or the rules anymore. This was about her dignity, about the way she had been made to feel small and insignificant for months. She was pregnant, and she had reached her breaking point. But the look in Mr. Lawson's eyes, cold, calculating, told me he wasn't about to let it slide. "Well, maybe you should," he said with a sneer. "Maybe you should have thought about that before you started making trouble. You've pushed me too far." Before I could say anything, Mr. Lawson stepped forward, his movements deliberate, almost too calm. He was making a point. But this time, it wasn't just the words he was throwing at us. His hand went to his belt, and I saw the flash of something metallic. Something I had never expected to see. A taser. It all happened in a split second. Sarah, still standing her ground, took a step back, holding her hands up in disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me," she said. But her voice cracked as the words left her lips. And then, without any warning, he aimed the taser directly at her. "Don't do this," I shouted, but it was too late. The electric crackle filled the room, sharp and violent, followed by the sickening thud as the prongs hit Sarah in the chest. She gasped in pain, her whole body convulsing as the current shot through her. Her legs buckled beneath her, and she crumpled to the floor with a loud cry. I froze. My mind couldn't process what had just happened. My wife, my pregnant wife, was lying there writhing in pain on the ground, while the man who had made our lives hell stood over her, with that smug look on his face. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. How could this be happening? How was this possible? The officers were still standing there, their expressions unchanged, as if they'd seen this kind of thing before. Officer Daniels looked at Mr. Lawson with a glance that almost seemed approving. "You need to calm down, Mr. Grayson," he said, his tone cold and dismissive. She wasn't listening. He did what he had to do. I couldn't hear anything else after that. My entire focus was on Sarah, her pained breaths as she struggled to get up, the shock still running through her system, her face contorted with pain and confusion. I dropped to my knees beside her, desperate to help her, to make sure she was okay. But she was too weak, too dazed. Her eyes were unfocused, her hands trembling as she tried to push herself up, but her body was fighting against her. "Sarah!" I shouted, panic rising in my chest. I reached for her, but she barely reacted, her body still spasming from the electric shock. The whole world seemed to blur around me as I looked up at Mr. Lawson, standing there, a look of cold indifference in his eyes. It was as though he was simply finishing what he had started, like this was nothing more than a small victory in his twisted game. And then I looked at the officers who still hadn't moved, still hadn't done anything. They were complicit. They weren't even looking at Sarah or at me. It was like they were all in on it, protecting him, making sure we stayed in our place. The weight of the situation hit me all at once. This wasn't just an assault, it was a display of power. Mr. Lawson had gone too far, and now the police were covering for him, making sure there were no consequences for his actions. I could feel the heat of fury building inside me, but there was nothing I could do. Sarah needed me. I had to make sure she was okay, that she didn't fall into unconsciousness. I gently helped her sit up, holding her close, trying to steady her as best I could, but my mind was racing. Every part of me was screaming for action, for something to break this insane cycle. But what could I do? They had all the power. The police, the HOA, Mr. Lawson. They had control over this entire neighborhood, and now they had taken it to a level I never thought possible. I looked at Sarah, who was still trying to catch her breath, her hand pressed against her chest, the pain still lingering. "We're going to get through this," I whispered, though I wasn't sure if I was trying to convince her or myself. "We have to. This won't be the end." But as I looked up, my heart sank. I knew deep down that things had just taken a dark turn. There was no going back from this. The peace we'd worked so hard to build was shattered in an instant, and I wasn't sure how we could put the pieces back together. The days after the taser incident felt like they were dragging on forever. Sarah was recovering, though the shock of what had happened still lingered in her eyes. The physical effects of the taser were fading, but the emotional toll it took on both of us was far from over. We had tried to stay low, to just deal with everything quietly, but the situation kept gnawing at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something bigger going on. I couldn't just let this go. The more I thought about the police's behavior that day, the more I realized how deeply involved they were. Officer Daniels and Hayes hadn't acted like neutral figures. They'd acted like they were there to protect Mr. Lawson, not us. And when I replayed the events over and over in my head, one thing stood out more than anything: the way they deferred to him, the way they'd done nothing when Sarah was hurt. I couldn't let this go, so I decided to dig deeper. I reached out to a few old contacts I had in the local government. I'd done some business in town over the years, and while I kept most of my dealings quiet, I had the right connections to get the answers I needed. What I found out shocked me to my core. It started innocently enough. I called a friend who worked in local zoning and planning, someone I trusted. I'd known him for years. I asked a simple question: had Mr. Lawson ever had any dealings with the police department? Maybe there was something I missed, some connection I hadn't noticed before. The answer I got wasn't exactly what I was expecting. "Lawson? Yeah, he's got some influence with the department. Hasn't been too public about it, though. But people in town know he's got a lot of strings to pull, especially when it comes to enforcement. Funny thing is, a lot of people don't even know that the department's been tied up with his interests for years." I was confused. "What do you mean? Tied up with his interests? The HOA president is involved with the police?" He hesitated for a moment, like he wasn't sure how much to say. "It's not just the police. Lawson has made a lot of money with property development and construction around here. He's got ties to a bunch of people. Some of them are in law enforcement. He's basically been pulling the strings behind the scenes, working with the department to make sure things go his way. They protect his interests, you know?" My mind raced. This was all starting to click into place. Mr. Lawson wasn't just some overbearing HOA president. He was a man who had managed to use his wealth and influence to bend the system to his will. The police weren't just backing him. They were working for him. And here I was, thinking I had been powerless, just another victim of his petty rules and harassment. But the real kicker came when my friend, after a long pause, added, "You know, you probably wouldn't have heard this, but Mr. Lawson doesn't have all the control. There's someone else who's been pulling the strings in the background. Someone who's been behind the scenes in this whole thing for a while." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Who?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The response was almost too quiet to hear, but it hit me like a punch to the gut. "You!" It took me a moment to process the words. "What do you mean, me?" He let out a nervous laugh, unsure if he should continue. "You didn't know? You've been involved in a series of business dealings with the department for years. Everyone thought you were just some low-key investor, but you've actually had significant influence over the department's operations for a while. You've got more say in things than anyone realizes, especially Lawson." I sat there stunned, my world spinning as the truth settled in. My mind flashed back to years of business dealings, partnerships, and investments I'd made under the radar. Deals that had always seemed like just another profitable opportunity. But now I understood. Somewhere along the way, I'd unknowingly accumulated a network of influence in the police department, And what was even more mind-boggling, Mr. Lawson had been using me as a shield all along, feeding off my influence to bolster his own power. He had played me, used me to further his agenda without my even realizing it. Every fine, every rule, every twisted moment had been orchestrated with the full knowledge that he had an ally in the police. They had protected him, allowed him to push the boundaries because they knew I'd never stand against them. After all, if anyone tried to take him down, they'd have to face the weight of everything I had behind me. The realization hit me like a freight train. I wasn't just an outsider anymore. I was in the middle of a tangled web of corruption, power, and manipulation, all hidden beneath the surface of my quiet suburban life. The very people who were supposed to protect us, the police, had been working hand in hand with someone who had made our lives a nightmare. The more I thought about it, the more disgusted I became. How could I have been so blind? How could I not see that the same system I thought I had influence over was the one being used against me, the one making my family's life a living hell? Everything had changed. The peace I thought we had, the quiet life I had worked so hard to build, it was all a lie, a facade created by the very people I had trusted. And now I had to figure out how to untangle myself from it all, how to stop Mr. Lawson, and how to confront a system that had been in bed with him from the start. The twist was unimaginable. I wasn't just a victim. I was part of the problem. And now I had to decide what to do with that power, with that knowledge. I could feel the weight of the truth pressing down on me, suffocating me. It had been days since I discovered the depth of the corruption, days of feeling like a pawn in a game I didn't even know I was playing. But now I knew exactly what I had to do. It wasn't just about seeking revenge anymore. It wasn't about making Mr. Lawson pay for what he did to Sarah or for the countless other things he had done to this community. It was about something much bigger. It was about justice. I had all the pieces now, the influence, the manipulation, the lies. It was time to use what I knew, to expose him for the fraud he truly was. I decided to confront him directly. The thought of facing him again made my blood boil, but I knew I had no other choice. It was either let him continue to run this neighborhood into the ground or take him down once and for all. I called Mr. Lawson and told him to meet me at his office at the HOA building. He agreed without hesitation. I knew he would. He always thought he had control of everything, and this was no different. He didn't know that I was now in control. I walked into the office, my heart pounding, but there was a calmness inside me, a certainty that had been missing in the past. Mr. Lawson looked up from behind his desk when I entered, his usual smug grin plastered on his face. "What's this about, Grayson?" he asked, leaning back in his chair, his tone dismissive. I didn't waste time. "I know everything," I said, my voice steady, though my fists were clenched at my sides. He laughed, a dismissive chuckle that seemed to be his way of brushing off anything he didn't want to hear. "You're going to have to be more specific than that." I stepped forward, leaning in just enough to make him feel the weight of my words. "I know about your deals with the police, how you've been using them to protect yourself and punish anyone who crosses you, how they've been helping you push through your agenda under the guise of law and order. You thought I wouldn't figure it out, didn't you?" For a moment, he said nothing. His eyes widened just slightly, a flicker of realization crossing his face before he regained his composure. He leaned forward, his voice colder now. "What are you talking about? I don't know what you think you know, but you've got it all wrong." But I wasn't backing down now. "No, you're the one who's got it wrong. You've been using my name, my influence, to protect yourself from the consequences of your actions. You've been running this neighborhood like it's your kingdom, and the police have been your personal enforcers. The fines, the harassment, it's all been part of your twisted little game, hasn't it?" His face started to harden, his eyes narrowing with a mix of anger and disbelief. "You don't know what you're talking about, Grayson. I've worked hard for everything I've achieved. You think I've been taking advantage of the system? That's ridiculous." I could feel the rage bubbling up inside me, but I kept it under control. "You've been manipulating the police for years, Lawson. You've used them to bully residents, to intimidate anyone who dared question you. And when you couldn't get your way, you turned to the one thing you knew you could control, the law. You thought I wouldn't find out, but I did. And now I'm here to expose you. There was a long pause. For a moment, he looked like he was weighing his options, like he was trying to decide whether to keep lying or come clean. But I could see the fear in his eyes now, the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. The power he'd wielded for so long was slipping through his fingers, and he knew it. You think you can just come in here and destroy everything I've built? He spat, his voice shaking with a mixture of anger and panic. You think you can just bring down the entire system because of some petty vendetta? You're nothing. You have no idea who you're messing with. I took a deep breath, then leaned forward. I know exactly who I'm messing with. I'm messing with a man who thought he could control everything. A man who used his influence to hurt people, to destroy lives, and who thought he was untouchable. Well, you're not untouchable anymore. Mr. Lawson stood up suddenly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He started pacing, his hands running through his hair in frustration. You don't know the half of it, Grayson. You think you're the only one with power around here? You think just because you've got a few connections, you can take me down? I let him rant. I wasn't going to let him distract me from what I came here to do. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a file, dropping it on his desk. It was thick with evidence, documents, photos, records of his illegal activities. This is your undoing. I've got everything. The deals, the payments, the blackmail. It's all right here. And once this goes public, your little empire will crumble. He glanced at the file, his face going pale as he saw the evidence laid out in front of him. He was no longer the confident, untouchable man he'd been just moments ago. Now he was a man cornered, and I could see the desperation in his eyes. I can't, he muttered, his voice shaking. You can't do this. You have no idea what you're doing. But I wasn't listening to his pleas anymore. I've been letting you get away with this for far too long. No one else is going to stop you. So, I'm doing it. This ends today. I could see the realization sinking in, the full weight of everything he'd done crashing down on him. But the truth couldn't be ignored anymore. His twisted web of lies and corruption was finally being unraveled, and there was nothing he could do to stop it now. The moment the file hit Mr. Lawson's desk, everything changed. The smug, untouchable air he'd carried for so long was gone, replaced by panic. I knew it wouldn't take long for the truth to spread once I revealed the evidence I had. The documents I'd gathered, the photos, the records, they were all irrefutable proof of his abuse of power, his manipulation of the police, and his illegal dealings under the guise of authority. I wasn't going to let him escape this time. With the police department under my control, I knew that now, with this newfound leverage, I could expose him. The very department that had once protected Mr. Lawson, shielding him from the consequences of his actions, would now be forced to turn on him. But it wasn't just about using the influence I had. It was about forcing the system to do what it was supposed to do in the first place: seek justice. I called in a few key officers who I knew weren't as deeply embedded in Lawson's network as the others. Daniels, Hayes, and a few others had been his loyal foot soldiers, but there were still a few good men left in the force. I couldn't trust all of them, but I knew the ones I called would listen. I sat down with them in a small, private meeting, the air thick with tension. I've got something you need to see, I said, sliding the file across the table. They exchanged nervous glances, knowing full well that this was not just another routine case. This was something much bigger. The officers flipped through the file, their eyes scanning the pages, as the weight of the evidence settled in. This is bad, one of them murmured under his breath. We had no idea. None of us did, I replied quietly. But now we know. Lawson has been using all of us. He's been running this town like his personal fiefdom, and he's got dirt on every one of you. There was a moment of silence before one of the officers spoke up. What do you want us to do? I leaned forward, locking eyes with them. You're the police. You're supposed to protect this community. I need you to do your job. Investigate him. Start with the abuse of power, the corruption. Don't just take his word for it anymore. This man has been lying to all of you, and you've been complicit. But it's not too late to make things right. The officers nodded, their resolve strengthening. They knew what needed to be done. They knew that Lawson's fall was inevitable, but it wasn't going to come without a fight. The system he'd manipulated was about to turn against him. I made a few calls to ensure the investigation would be thorough. I couldn't risk anyone else getting in the way, so I had to be sure the right people were handling the case. The evidence I had was just the beginning. It was up to them to dig deeper, uncover more, and find every link in Lawson's chain of deceit. Within days, things began to unravel for him. The police launched an investigation into his dealings, starting with the contracts he'd been funneling through the department, the payments he'd made to ensure preferential treatment, the illegal fines he'd levied against unsuspecting homeowners. It was all coming to light. The officers who had once stood by him were now scrambling to distance themselves from the scandal as the full scope of the corruption became undeniable. The press caught wind of the investigation, and soon the entire community was buzzing with shock and outrage. Mr. Lawson, who had once been seen as the pillar of the neighborhood, was now exposed as nothing more than a fraud. His carefully curated image, built on lies and manipulation, was crashing down around him. Residents who had once been too scared to speak up against him began to share their stories, recounting how they had been harassed, fined unjustly, or intimidated into silence. The more people came forward, the more it became clear just how deeply entrenched his abuse of power had been. I watched from a distance, the sick satisfaction of seeing Lawson's empire crumble, slowly sinking in. His downfall was coming, piece by piece, and it wasn't long before legal action was taken. Charges of abuse of power, bribery, conspiracy, and corruption were filed against him. The very system he had used to hold everyone in fear was now being turned against him. His reputation was in ruins. His wealth and influence were slipping away, and his connections in the police department, the ones he'd used to protect himself, were now his greatest liability. But the most satisfying part of all of this wasn't just seeing Lawson's reputation tarnished. It wasn't even about the legal ramifications he'd soon face. It was about the people, the community that he had once tormented, the residents who had been living in fear of his wrath, the ones he'd manipulated, the ones who felt powerless against his authority, were now speaking out, empowered by the truth. In the weeks that followed, the community began to heal. The HOA's grip over the neighborhood loosened, and people started to breathe again, free from the oppressive rules and punishments Lawson had set in place. Neighborhood meetings were no longer tense affairs where residents cowered under Lawson's watchful eye. Instead, they were spaces for open discussion and collective decision-making. The power dynamics that had been in place for so long began to shift, and the neighborhood started to feel like a community once again. As for Mr. Lawson, his fate was sealed. He was arrested and taken into custody, his once invincible stature reduced to a man facing a long list of charges. His fall from grace was swift and brutal. The man who had terrorized an entire neighborhood and manipulated the justice system to his advantage was now powerless, exposed for all the world to see. For me, it was a bittersweet victory. I had done what I set out to do, but the damage had already been done. The peaceful life I had once known, the life I'd worked so hard to build with Sarah, had been shattered in ways I couldn't easily undo. Still, there was a sense of relief. I had taken back control of my life, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like the community could finally start to heal, free from the clutches of one man's corruption. Sarah's recovery was slow, both physically and emotionally. The taser had left marks on her body, but the scars it left on her mind took longer to heal. Every time I looked at her, I could see the quiet sadness in her eyes, the weight of what had happened still there. The memory of that day, the moment when Mr. Lawson had crossed the line, when the police had stood by and done nothing, kept replaying in her mind. She tried to shake it off, to focus on the future, but I could see it in her face. It wasn't something you could just forget, but Sarah was strong, and she did her best to move forward step by step. With time, the emotional scars began to fade, though I knew they would never fully disappear. We had been through so much and it had changed us both. But we were still together, and that was what mattered most. As for the neighborhood, things were different now. The community that had once lived in fear of the HOA's oppressive rule was starting to rebuild. People who had once felt powerless were now coming together, united by a common goal: fairness. It wasn't going to be easy, but they were determined to restore what had been lost. The new HOA leadership was committed to transparency. to making sure the mistakes of the past would never be repeated. The corrupt practices of Mr. Lawson were now behind them, and the residents were taking back their power. The neighborhood meetings were different. People spoke openly, shared their concerns, and worked together to create a community they could all be proud of. It felt like a fresh start for everyone. For us, life slowly began to find its way back to normal. The peace we'd fought so hard for was no longer just a distant dream. We could finally relax, knowing that the looming threat of Mr. Lawson in his reign of terror had ended. We didn't have to worry about the HOA anymore, or about facing the constant barrage of fines, harassment, or unjust rules. Our home was once again a sanctuary, a place where we could focus on each other, on the family we were building. Looking back on everything that had happened, I found myself reflecting on the twists and turns that had brought us here. What had started as a simple desire for peace had spiraled into something far more complicated. It was a fight for justice, for the right to live without fear, and for the truth to come to light. In the end, justice had prevailed. Mr. Lawson's power had crumbled, the truth had been exposed, and the system that had been corrupted was being reformed. But there was more to it than that. This wasn't just about the victory we'd earned. It was about what we had learned along the way. We had seen firsthand how easily power could be abused, how the system could be manipulated, and how those in positions of authority could harm those they were supposed to protect. But we had also seen the strength of a community when they came together to demand change, the courage of those who refused to stay silent, and the resilience of a family that fought for what was right. And now I knew it was my responsibility to ensure something like this would never happen again. It wasn't just about stopping one man. It was about making sure the system worked for everyone. I was committed to using my influence, not for personal gain, but for the good of the community. I would stay vigilant, stay involved, and make sure that the lessons we'd learned from this nightmare were never forgotten. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, it felt like we could face it with hope. Together, Sarah and I had weathered the storm, and now it was time to rebuild. We had faced the darkness and come out the other side stronger. And as the neighborhood began to heal, as we all began to heal, I knew that no matter what came next, we would face it as a family, united, stronger, and ready for whatever the future held.